Hi, I'm Bridget. Welcome to my kitchen where I elevate the everyday with inspiring recipes that are doable for any cook. I'm of the mind that everyone should have a go-to chocolate cake recipe. And just in case you don't, today I'm sharing my family's chocolate layer cake recipe. This cake is simple to make and decadently moist. Join me as I make this easy crowd pleaser. My mom found this recipe in a magazine almost 50 years ago, and it's been our family's favorite birthday cake recipe ever since. It's become a favorite for a few reasons. One, because it's so decadently moist. And two, the recipe makes 2 layers, so feeds a crowd. And 3, it's quick to mix up. Plus, the frosting is deliciously frothy. To get started, I've preheated the oven to 350 degrees. We'll start by combining the dry ingredients. That's 3 cups of all-purpose flour. And I like to spoon my flour in so it doesn't get too dense. If you scoop your flour, then there's a good chance that you'll end up with more flour than you actually need, and your baked goods might be a little heavy. Next, we'll add 2 cups of granulated sugar. I'm using a scant 2 cups, and I have used as little as 1.5 cups in this recipe, and it has worked out just fine. And I have 6 tablespoons of cocoa. That's 1/4 cup plus 2 tablespoons. And I will add 2 teaspoons of baking soda. And finally, 1 teaspoon of salt. And I'll whisk those together. Next, we'll get the wet ingredients together. And we'll start with 1/2 cup of butter. And I'm going to melt this butter. And that's part of why this recipe is so easy to put together, because we don't need to cream butter and sugar. And also, because we melt the butter, you can substitute oil for this recipe, which is great if you want to make the cake as a vegan recipe, because this cake has no eggs. So I'm just going to put that in the microwave for about 20 seconds. I'm just going to whisk that to melt the final few bits. And then I will add 2 teaspoons of pure vanilla and 2 teaspoons of vinegar. And it's the vinegar reacting with the baking soda that actually gives this cake such a beautiful texture. And I'm adding 2 cups of water. Now that we have the dry ingredients mixed and the wet ingredients mixed, I'm going to prep our pans. I'm using 2 8-inch round cake pans, but you can also make this cake as a 9 by 13 pan. I like to butter my cake pans and then line them with a little bit of parchment paper. But if you don't add the parchment paper, you can grease and flour these pans. And because it's a chocolate cake and it's nice and dark, instead of using flour on top of the butter, you could always use cocoa. And I'm just going to line them with 2 cutouts. This will just make it a little bit easier to get the cakes out of the pans once they're cooked. Now I wanted to make sure that the pans were ready before I combined the wet and the dry ingredients. because as soon as that mixture is together, as soon as the cake batter comes together, I want to get it in the pans and in the oven right off the bat. Now we can add the wet to the dry to get our cake batter made. I am going to use the beaters, but I'm going to start by hand, just so the flour and cocoa doesn't go flying everywhere. Now there are a few lumps in the batter, which is why it's so great to have beaters. Once all the lumps are incorporated, then you can stop mixing. Still want to make sure there's no flour caught at the bottom. Now we're just going to pour this into the prepared pans, trying to portion it as equally as possible. There we go. Our cakes are ready to go in the oven. And remember, I've preheated the oven to 350 degrees. Our cakes are in the oven and they will bake for 35 to 40 minutes. That gives us lots of time to get started on the frosting. Now this is an extra chocolatey frosting. It has a full 3/4 of a cup of cocoa in it. We'll start by creaming 1/2 cup of butter, and this is room temperature butter, so it's easier to work with. And I'm just going to cream that a bit. To the softened butter, I'm adding 1 teaspoon of pure vanilla and 1/4 cup of water. This is tepid water. You don't want it to be warm or it'll start to melt the butter. Now it's not going to mix together perfectly until we add the dry ingredients, but don't worry about that. So we will add 3 cups of icing sugar. And our 3/4 cup of cocoa. Now I'm not going to run the beaters right off the bat. I'm going to stir it a little bit, otherwise everything will just poof out. Now, if your icing is looking a little bit stiff, and mine is, I'm going to add just a little bit more water to the mixture, starting about a tablespoon at a time. This frosting is smooth and rich and all set for frosting our cake once it comes out of the oven and has had a couple of hours to cool. The timer has gone. Oh, and our cakes are ready. They have been in for 40 minutes and they've risen nicely. We'll just set them aside to cool for a couple of hours. I'm going to let them cool in the pan for about 10 minutes, and then I'll remove them from the pan and let them finish cooling on the rack. Now that our cakes have cooled, it's time to frost them. We'll start by adding about 1/4 of the frosting to the top of the first layer. Now the original frosting recipe called for 1 egg yolk in addition to all the ingredients that I used, but I prefer not to use the egg yolk, a raw egg yolk, just because this cake might sit on the counter for a couple of days and I don't want to worry about anything going wrong. We'll frost it right to the edge. Now for layer 2. If you want a really flat top, you could flip and frost the bottom of the cake, but I decided that I would like to have a bit of a rounded top. Now I have no great skill when it comes to frosting a cake. But the handy thing is, when it's a chocolate cake with chocolate frosting, all of my mistakes are kind of hidden. If you're a fan of mocha, when you're making the cake, instead of adding 2 cups of water, you could always use 1 cup of water and 1 cup of good strong coffee. And in place of the water in the frosting, you could use coffee or you could use milk. Sometimes I make this cake with whole wheat flour instead of all-purpose flour. It calls for 3 cups of flour, so you could use 1.5 cups of whole wheat if you'd like to try that version. A homemade cake is always extra special, and when it comes to celebrations, nothing beats a layer cake, especially a rich, dark chocolate layer cake. I hope this recipe becomes a family favorite in your house too. Thanks for watching.